Imagine this, it is 1894. A king, a real king, stands before a French general who has just conquered his land, burned his palace, and scattered his people. The French officers extends his hand. He expects surrender, he expects submission. But the king does not bow. He looks the general dead in the eyes and says something that would echo through history. He says, "A king does not surrender. A king falls or a king's fight." The man was Béhanzin, king of Dahomey, the man the French called the most formidable enemy France had ever faced in Africa, and today we are going to tell the story. Before we talk about the king, we need to talk about the kingdom, because you can't understand Béhanzin without understanding Dahomey. And trust me, once you learn about Dahomey, you will never look back at African history the same way. And again, Dahomey, located in what is today the modern country of Benin in West Africa, founded around the early 1600s by the Fon people. Now, when most people picture ancient African kingdom, they think empires in deserts, Timbuktu, Mali, Egypt. But Dahomey was something different. Dahomey was something fierce. From its very beginning, this was a kingdom built on military power, centralized governments, and ferocious sense of pride. The kings of Dahomey, called the Hausu, were not ceremonial figureheads. They were warriors, strategists, gods to their people. And the kingdom had something that made even the most battle-hardened European soldiers go pale with fear. And elite military, unlike anything else in the world. They were called the Agojie. You might know them by another name, the Dahomey Amazon, an all-female army, thousands strong, trained from childhood to be the most lethal soldiers in the region. They carried machetes, rifles, and zero fear. European officers who survived encounters with the Agojie wrote home with trembling hands. One French soldier wrote, and I quote directly from the historical records, that this woman fought with ferocity that far surpasses the men. This was the kingdom that Béhanzin was born to rule. This was the legacy he was supposed to protect, and this was the world that was about to be shattered. Béhanzin was born around 1845. His birth name, the name his mother gave him, was Kondo. He was the son of King Gele, the reigning Hausu of Dahomey. Growing up in the royal court of Abomey, the magnificent wall capital city of the kingdom, Kondo saw everything. He saw how his father commanded absolute loyalty. He saw how the Agojie trained before sunrise every single morning. He saw diplomats and traders from across the world come to pay tribute. He saw a kingdom that was proud, but he also saw something else. He saw the clouds gathering on the horizon, because by the time Kondo was growing up, the world was changing. Europe had developed a hunger that had no bottom, a hunger called colonialism. The British were pushing south from the north, the French were pushing east from their colonies on the coast, and every African kingdom, no matter how powerful, was beginning to feel the wall closing in. Kondo watched this as a young prince and burned with something deep in his chest, not fear, anger, righteousness, burning hunger. In 1889, King Glele, Kondo's father, died, and in a moment that would change history forever, Kondo ascended the throne. It took his royal name, Béhanzin. In the Fon language, this name carries meaning that stops you in your track, the shark who troubles water. The shark, that was not an accident, that was not poetry, that was a declaration. Béhanzin came to the throne during one of the most dangerous moments in African history. 1889 was the tail end of what historians call the Scramble for Africa. In 1884, just 5 years before Béhanzin became king, European powers had sat down in Berlin, Germany. They drew a line on a map. They divided an entire continent amongst themselves without asking a single African king, a single African elder, a single African person. France had its eyes on Dahomey. Why? Because Dahomey starts on a stretch of coastline the French called La Côte d'Esclave, the slave coast. And now that the transatlantic slave trade was ending, they wanted something else from that coast: trade, taxes, territory, control. The French had already established a small foothold at Cotonou, a port town on Dahomey coast. They had a treaty, or so they claimed, that gave them rights to that port. Béhanzin looked at that treaty, he looked at the French, and said, with the authority of a man who has been born to rule, that treaty means nothing. Cotonou is Dahome's land, and it has always been Dahome's land. It will remain Dahome's land. The French were not used to being spoken to like that, not by an African king. Negotiations began, then broke down, then began again, then broke down again, and in 1890, the first shots were fired. The First Franco-Dahomean War of 1890, France sent troops under a general named Alfred Ami de Dodds, a man of mixed Senegalese and French heritage, which was noted by many historians as deeply ironic. To assert control over Cotonou, Béhanzin sent his army including the Agojie, and what happened next shocked the French military establishment to its core. The Dahomey forces fought them to a near standstill. The Agojie in particular fighting in close quarters with machetes and rifles, inflicting casualties the French had not anticipated. French soldiers equipped with modern rifles, artillery, and military training were being pushed back. Think about what that meant for a moment. One of the greatest military powers on earth, the same nation that had fought Napoleon's wars across Europe, was being held back by a West African kingdom that Europe had dismissed as primitive. The war ended in the stalemate with a negotiated treaty in October 1890. France agreed to pay Béhanzin an annual tribute to maintain access to Cotonou, an annual tribute, France paying a West African king. Let that sit with you. Béhanzin had not just survived, he had won. He had forced the largest empire in Europe to write him a check. But Béhanzin was no fool. He knew this was not over. He knew the French would come back. So he spent the next 2 years doing something brilliant. He went shopping. Between 1890 and 1892, Béhanzin launched one of the most underrated military modernization campaigns in African history. He made contact with Germany arms dealers. He purchased thousands of modern rifles, repeating rifles, the kind that could fire multiple rounds without reloading. He hired European military trainees, men who were willing to work for gold, to train his soldiers in modern tactical formation. He expanded the Agojie, bringing their numbers up to an estimated 4,000 to 6,000 warriors. He forfeited the capital at Dahomey. He forged alliance with neighboring kingdoms. This was a king who understood the world was changing and refused to be left behind. He was not clinging to tradition blindly. He was using tradition as a foundation and building something new on top of it, a modern army, a dangerous army. But the French were watching, and in 1892, France tore up the treaty. They said Béhanzin had been raiding French-protected villages. Béhanzin said he was simply defending his own territory. Historians debate who was technically right, but the outcome is not in debate. France declared war. The Second Franco-Dahomean War had begun, and this time they were sending everything they had. September 1892, General Dodds returned, this time with a force of over 3,000 soldiers, French Foreign Legion troops, Senegalese tirailleurs, African soldiers fighting under the French flag, artillery, gunboats on the river. Béhanzin assembled his force. Estimates put the Dahomey army at somewhere between 8,000 and 12,000 soldiers, including the Agojie. The battle that followed were unlike anything West Africa had ever seen. The Dahomey forces attacked that night, a tactic the French had not fully prepared for. One recorded engagement at the Battle of Cotonou saw Agojie warriors breach French defenses, positions, and fight in hand-to-hand combat against trained Foreign Legion soldiers. The French held barely, but they held, and slowly, painfully, the weight of French artillery began to tip the scale. Here is the brutal truth of this war. Béhanzin's army was brave beyond measure. They were tactically creative. They were fiercely motivated, but they were fighting rifles and artillery with rifles and courage. And eventually, courage alone is not enough against an empire willing to use industrial warfare. By November 1892, the French reached Dahomey. Béhanzin made a decision that historians still debate. Rather than let the French capture his capital intact, he ordered Dahomey burned. He burned his own palace, his own city, the royal treasures, the ancestral shrines, the centuries of history built into those walls. Rather than let the French have it, If this is not the act of a king, I don't know what it is. Béhanzin retreated into the forest. For nearly 2 years, from 1892 to 1894, he conducted a guerrilla resistance from the jungle. He refused to surrender. His people still supported him. Villages sheltered him. Farmers fed his soldiers. But slowly, the French tightened the net. They captured his allies. They cut off his supply line. They put prices on the head of those who sheltered him. And in January 1894, faced with the destruction of more of his people, Béhanzin did something that required more courage than any battlefield. He surrendered, not because he was broken, not because he gave up, but because he refused to let his people bear any more suffering on his behalf. He walked into the French camp. He stood straight. He looked General Dodds in the eyes and he said, in words recorded by the French officers present that day, "I am Béhanzin. I am King of Dahomey. I have come to discuss the fate of my people. Not I surrender, not I beg for mercy. I am the king. I am here to discuss." Even in defeat, this man negotiated as a sovereign. The French exiled him first to Martinique in Caribbean, then to Algeria in North Africa, far from his people, far from his land, far from everything he had ever known. He would never return home. Here is the part of Béhanzin's story that most videos skip, the human part. In exile in Martinique, Béhanzin did not sit in silence and withered. He lived. He learned French, the language of the men who had taken everything from him, so that he could advocate for himself and his people directly. He gave interviews to newspapers. He wrote letters to French officials. He argued in their own court, in their own language, that the annexation of Dahomey was illegal, that the treaty had been fraudulent, that his people deserved their sovereignty back. He became a celebrity of sorts in France. Artists came to paint him. Poets wrote about him. The French public, who were often more nuisance than their government, were fascinated by this dignified, articulated, unbroken king in their midst. There is a famous portrait painted of Béhanzin during his exile. He is dressed in a dark coat. He sits upright. This is what everyone who sees this portrait notices first. His eyes do not look defeated. They look patient, like a man who knows that history, even when it is cruel, eventually tells the truth. In 1906, Béhanzin was transferred to Blida, Algeria. His health was declining. He was far from home. He was tired. On December 10, 1906, King Béhanzin of Dahomey died in exile. He was approximately 61 years old. He never saw his homeland again. But here is where the story takes a turn, because the French thought that when Béhanzin died in exile, that was the end. They were wrong. In 1961, the modern nation of Benin, built on the land of the old Dahomey kingdom, gained its independence from France, and the first thing the new nation did, they looked back at their history. They found Béhanzin and they said, this man was right. Today, Béhanzin is considered one of the greatest national heroes of Benin. His portrait hangs in government buildings. Schools are named after him. His story is taught to every child. In 2016, in a moment of extraordinary historical justice, France returned royal treasures looted from Dahomey during the conquest. Priceless artifacts, thrones, ceremonial objects, pieces of the burned palace returned after over a century. And in 2021, the film The Woman King brought global attention back to the world of Dahomey and the Agojie. A new generation, millions of people who had never heard the name Béhanzin, suddenly wanted to know everything. That is what legacy looks like. It does not die when the man dies. It waits. It waits until the world is ready to hear it. And there is one more thing. Béhanzin represents something that has been systematically erased from global consciousness: the extraordinary complexity, sophistication, and power of African civilization before colonialism. Dahomey was not a simple village, it was a state with a professional military, a complex bureaucracy, international trade network, royal art tradition, and a philosophical system about kingship and power that was thousands of years in the making. The colonizer told the world that they were bringing civilization to Africa. Béhanzin's story asks, what was already there? The answer is extraordinary. King Béhanzin, born Kondo, the shark who troubles the water, the last independent king of Dahomey, a man who faced down an empire, not with arrogance but with dignity, a man who lost every battle and never lost himself, a man whose bones lies in North Africa, but those spirits in every person who has ever refused to bow when the world told them to break. History remembers the powerful, but sometimes if you look closely enough, history remembers the right. If this story moved you, share it, because Béhanzin waited over 100 years for the world to hear his name properly. The least we can do is make sure a few more people hears it today. Thank you for watching. Do not forget to subscribe.